So what happens when two of the world's biggest faiths come together to debate the very heart of their beliefs? In this explainer, we are stepping right into a really fascinating Muslim-Christian dialogue that took place in Khartoum, Sudan. We're going to walk through the source material from that event, breaking down the core arguments from critiques of the Gospels all the way to claims of prophecies found in the Bible itself.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll set the stage for this pretty unique encounter. Then, we'll dive into their critique of the Gospels. After that, we'll explore how they presented Islam, not as a new religion, but as the original faith of all prophets. And to wrap it up, we'll look at how they used the Bible itself to argue for the coming of the prophet Muhammad.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the arguments that were made, we first need to understand the scene. The setting and the whole purpose of this really significant meeting. Right from the get-go, the ambition for this dialogue was set incredibly high. You can just feel it in this opening quote from one of the organizers, Sheikh Abdallah Saleh. The stated goal here wasn't about scoring points or winning a debate. It was about a genuine shared search for truth on the biggest questions we can ask.
So what we're looking at here is a very deliberate, very structured meeting in Khartoum. And according to our source material, the Muslim scholars really came prepared. They had studied Christian beliefs in depth with the specific goal of addressing what they saw as misrepresentations and, of course, to present their own theological perspective.
So with that context in mind, the dialogue wasted no time at all. The first major item on the agenda, as our source lays it out, was a direct, pretty critical look at the Christian New Testament. So, how did they start this scriptural critique? Well, they jumped right in by highlighting what they called internal contradictions within the Gospels. And they began with a very pointed and, on the surface, very simple question about the crucifixion story. And this really shows their opening point perfectly. The source material puts two accounts right next to each other. On the left, you've got the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which all say that a man named Simon was forced to carry the cross. But then on the right, you see the Gospel of John, which says Jesus carried it himself. For the speakers at the dialogue, this apparent contradiction was the perfect launchpad for questioning the consistency of the entire narrative. From there, the text moves on to another absolutely pivotal event in the Christian story, and it raises another point of what they saw as a major discrepancy, the timeline of the Last Supper. This table really lays out the core of their next point. According to the speakers at the dialogue, there's a critical difference in the timing here. Mark, Matthew, and Luke seem to describe the Last Supper as the Passover meal, which would mean the crucifixion happened on Friday. But John's Gospel says the supper happened before the Passover. The speakers argue that this implies a Thursday crucifixion, presenting a conflicting timeline for one of the most foundational events in Christianity. All right, so after laying out these scriptural critiques, the speakers at the dialogue shifted gears in a big way. They moved on to their central affirmative argument, and this really involves a fundamental reframing of religious history itself. And this gets us to a really crucial definition they put forward. From their point of view, Islam isn't a religion that just began in the 7th century. They defined it as the original, timeless act of submitting to the one God, a universal message they argued was taught by every single prophet throughout all of history. And this slide is such a great way to visualize that core claim. Just look at the chain connecting these huge figures. The argument being made was that if Islam simply means submission to God, then every one of these prophets, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and yes, Jesus, was in essence a Muslim. They weren't seen as starting different religions, but as links in one single, unbroken chain of monotheism. So, building on that foundation, the dialogue then took another fascinating turn. It went back to the Bible itself, arguing that it actually contains specific prophecies that foretell the arrival of the prophet Muhammad. The speakers pointed right to this passage from the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. In it, God promises Moses that he will raise up a future prophet who would be like you, meaning like Moses himself. Now, the absolute key to the interpretation they offered at the dialogue hangs on two words, their brethren. The argument goes like this. If the prophecy was about another Israelite prophet, the text would have said, from among you. But by saying from among their brethren, they argue it has to be referring to a related people, the Ishmaelites, from whom the prophet Muhammad descended. But they didn't stop in the Old Testament. The speakers also pointed to the words of Jesus in the Gospel of John, specifically this promise of a future helper or spirit of truth. So how did they argue this helper was a human prophet and not the Holy Spirit? Well, they connected it to another thing Jesus said. I still have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. The interpretation offered was basically this. If the disciples weren't ready for the whole truth just yet, then the helper who guides humanity into all truth couldn't be the Holy Spirit arriving just a few days later. Instead, they argued, it must be a future human prophet who would come to bring that complete final revelation. So let's just pull all that together for a second. To quickly recap the perspective presented at this dialogue, as our source describes it, it's really a three-part argument. It kicks off with a scriptural critique, questioning the internal consistency of the New Testament. Then it completely reframes Islam as the original, universal faith of all prophets. And finally, it claims to find evidence for its final prophet right inside the biblical texts themselves. You know, when you explore a dialogue like this, it leaves you with a really profound question that goes way beyond any single faith. How much of belief comes from the words on the page, and how much comes from the lens we're all using to read them? It just goes to show that the conversation is often not just about what a sacred book says, but about what we believe it means. And that's a question right at the very heart of faith itself.